This video is dedicated in loving memory to my good friend, Billy from the Game Chasers, who unfortunately passed away this week. I did make a video on the second channel just kind of talking about it and talking about what kind of person he was and what kind of friend he was to me. I'll put a link to it in the description box down below. But I did want to share this clip from an older video on the channel where I hit him up. I was like, hey, you want a cameo in a video? He was like, yeah, sure. What's it about? I was like, it's about the Sega 32X. He was like, all right, I got you. I was like, all right, if you just want to talk about the system a little bit or share some thoughts on it, feel free. He's like, nah, I got you. And then he sent me this clip. And I didn't ask a single thing. I didn't ask context. I didn't question it. I was like, you know what? This is perfect. So enjoy this little clip. Rest easy, Billy. I love you, brother. Let's get my buddy Billy from the Game Chasers thoughts on the 32X.
The Sega CD sucks.
Thanks, Billy. Thanks. Appreciate that, buddy. So recently there has been quite a few talks, chatters, and smatters about the Nintendo Switch 2 and kind of how everything has been going thus far with the system. Some people seem to love it. Some people are kind of in the middle. Some people are being negative about the system. Some people feel that people are being overly negative about the system. And it's a very diverse sort of topic here because what's good for the goose isn't necessarily good for the gander. Now, the Nintendo Switch 2 is, of course, only a few months old, but we have seen some things and we have seen some trends from Nintendo that can be a little bit worrying when it comes to this system. But recently, a large discussion on whether or not there is Nintendo Switch 2 buyer's remorse has been started by a fellow YouTuber. Now, I don't know this guy all that well. I have seen some of his videos popped up and I've checked a few of them out, but his recent video on talking about Nintendo Switch 2 buyer's remorse has really caught on fire. People have been sending me this video asking me what I think about it. The YouTube channel is called Nintendine. I have watched this video thoroughly. I'll have a link to it in the description box down below so you guys can check it out as well after watching this video, because it's about a 20 or so minute video and I'm not going to summarize his entire video and all his entire thoughts. I more so just want to talk about some of the talking points that he brought up, because I do think he brings up some pretty interesting points that are definitely worth having a discussion about. Remember, all because you're having a discussion about something or maybe even having a negative slant towards something doesn't inherently mean you want the thing to fail or you want the worst for the system and, Nintendo sucks. It's more so just concerns with the system itself. Now, of course, one of the main things about the Nintendo Switch 2 is that we're still only a couple months in. But with the recent Nintendo Direct, it's definitely laid out a roadmap of what to expect in the near future. And for some people, they're not really satisfied with what Nintendo has shown for the near future. And honestly, some games definitely hit harder than other games for me. I'm looking forward to games like Hyrule Warriors. I'm looking forward to Metroid Prime 4, but Pokemon, Kirby, Air Riders, I could kind of live without those. Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 with its interesting price point and really not much added into it is definitely a cause for concern as well. But that's kind of one of the main points that was in the video, was that a lot of people feel underwhelmed with the loadout of the system from, potentially the launch window of it, which many people consider to be the first 6 months. And I think it kind of depends on what you're looking forward to and what you're hoping for. I do think it is a bit strange from a consumer perspective to not have something like a new 3D Mario game, or even, a remaster, like an actual remaster of an older Legend of Zelda game in kind of this first launch window for the system. Really, so far, the two big games from Nintendo have indeed been, of course, Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. Now, I think both of these games are really well done and fun games, and I do understand why Mario Kart World was the pack-in title if you bought the bundle title or the main flagship launch title. Look at Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. That was the best-selling game for Nintendo in a very, very long time. It sold astronomical numbers, so obviously people are interested in Mario Kart, and Nintendo definitely looked at it from a business perspective. All of the information that we've gotten so far about the game selling well is indeed true. Now, how much of that is because people don't want to pay $80 and they want to get it in the bundle? I mean, your mileage is going to vary on that, but we do know that sometime in the fall, Nintendo is going to cease to offer the bundle, and then we'll start to see kind of how Mario Kart World sales really turn out, especially with the holiday season. Donkey Kong Bonanza, I think, is a great platformer. It's a game that I've had a lot of fun with, but it's Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong hasn't really lit the world on fire in terms of game sales really since the Super Nintendo, so it's not really considered to be like a flagship title for Nintendo. Donkey Kong games have definitely moved into more of a supplemental role. Now, Donkey Kong Bonanza could be trying to get Donkey Kong into a more, flagship title that is more recently seen and more vividly seen within the community. Obviously, with games like, or movies, I should say, like the Mario movie and stuff like that, Donkey Kong playing a role, the theme park stuff. You kind of see what I'm alluding to here is that the rollout for the Nintendo Switch 2 has definitely been a lot more business conscious than I think maybe some people were anticipating. The Switch 1 was kind of this weird and wacky thing, but Nintendo loaded up like the second half of the year for the Nintendo Switch 1 with very, very heavy hitter games. Even the launch title, Breath of the Wild, while technically a Wii game, that still lit the world on fire because it was so different. It was so unique. And with the rollout of games that we've had so far, it's kind of been more so, nothing that really is exactly lighting the world quite on fire. More safer things, more things that you would come to expect maybe a little bit later on in a console generation, and not necessarily taking a big risk. Now, there are a bunch of other points that are brought up in this video that I'm also not going to touch on all that much. I'll leave it up for you guys to watch that video. But there was one point that I found to be very well done and very well thought of, and is definitely something that is kind of resonating with me quite a bit. And that is how this system was presented in the first Nintendo Direct for the Nintendo Switch 2. And one of the focal points of the system during this Nintendo Direct presentation for the Switch 2. And that was the power aspect of it. You might remember they spent a lot of time telling you about technology and power and what this system was going to be able to do, which is very unlike modern Nintendo because they never talk about stuff like that. Ever since the Wii, this has been a conversation that has been rarely had when it comes to talking about specs and what the system is capable of doing. There was a strong emphasis on things like 120 frames per second, 4K visuals, HDR support, things that are obviously not targeted towards Nintendo's usual demographic of everything is fun, yes, the graphics may take a back seat, but you're playing the games for the IPs, you're playing the games for the characters, you're playing the games for the fun aspect. But there was a strong emphasis on things like power during this presentation, giving people the idea that this was going to be something that was heavily focused on to some degree when it came to the system, and more importantly, how games were going to run on the system. Because I don't think anyone looked at that and said, oh, well, this is going to be amazing for first-party Nintendo games, because Nintendo always gets the most out of their hardware. They always have, I should say usually, most of the time, they have very visually impressive games on their system, and more often than not, most of the best-looking games on a system are indeed first-party Nintendo titles. It was more so about third-party games, and we learned about parody of sports games and stuff like that, and yes, there's feature parity for the most part, although there is no crossplay with, PS5 and Xbox Series versions of the games. But a lot of these sports games are running at, 30 frames per second. And it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. You were talking all about these sports games and how they were going to run great and all that sort of stuff. And, when you're talking about a sports game in particular, obviously, frame rates are indeed very important. Obviously, you played older games that didn't have, 60 frames per second, but it has been a long time since most people have been playing 30 frame per second basketball, unless you were a Switch 1 owner. And I think that's what kind of stings about things like NBA 2K. The Switch 1 games were 30 frames per second. This new, powerful system that is coming in at a higher price point of the original Switch 1 is also running NBA 2K at 30 frames per second. Now, it does look better, but if it doesn't play better, does it necessarily matter if it looks better? And I feel like some of that does come down to third-party developers, of course, and getting the most out of their system. And I do think that over time, you will see better frame rates for sports games on the Nintendo Switch 2. I think WWE 2K25 is a shining beacon of an example of that, because that game runs at 60 frames per second. But you're also still getting that experience that you got on the Switch 1 with a lot of third-party games, where, large concessions are having to be made, usually in terms of the frame rate, games running at half the frame rate. And we were told that things like DLSS would be able to, rectify these situations. And hopefully, over time, it will. But as of right now, it's kind of like, well, maybe things are going to be very similar. Even though it was kind of positioned that things were going to be different, maybe that's not going to be the case. And if that is the case, what's going to happen with a lot of these games, and what sort of experiences are we going to be getting out of a lot of these games? But of course, the main thing is it's always going to sell. It's Nintendo. What's the #1 selling game on Amazon right now? Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. I always kind of bring it back to, a lot of people that probably do feel buyer's remorse. It's like, I feel like we are, and I'm not saying I feel buyer's remorse, because obviously, I had to get the system to cover the games and stuff like that. But it does kind of feel similar to the PS5 and Xbox launches, because, those weren't exactly great. If I didn't need those to make videos, I probably wouldn't have bought either of those systems within the first year. But with Nintendo, it always kind of feels different. And maybe Nintendo is looking at this more so in a different lens than a lot of us were potentially expecting to. I still think the future is very bright for the system, but I can understand why some people do feel potentially buyer's remorse with this thing, especially if they were expecting things to be significantly better than they were on the Switch 1. And thus far, those instances seem to be a bit few and far between. The third-party games that are like, wow, these are really impressive. It seems like we have more games that there's questions about, more so than a game like Street Fighter 6 or WWE 2K25, which are really good third-party ports on the system. But I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about this. Do you have any buyer's remorse with the Nintendo Switch 2? Let me know in the comment section down below. Like I said, I'll have a link to the original video. Go check it out. There are a bunch of other points that I did not bring up. And, check out that video. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, share. Hit the bell as well. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.